Have you ever wondered why some men only begin to feel the weight of love once it's already been buried beneath the silence she left behind? Not all women leave the same echo when they go. Some vanish like fog, soft, forgettable, a momentary ache. But the powerful woman? She disappears like a cathedral collapsing in his soul, not with noise, but with meaning. And when she's gone, something begins to wake inside of him. Something ancient, unspoken, and terrifying. A recognition he would never admit aloud, that he met the divine and treated it like it was disposable. At first, he tells himself she was too much, too complicated, too silent, too unattainable. But that's just the ego speaking, the mask he wears to keep the grief from roaring through his ribs. Because deep down, buried beneath his bravado and distractions, there is a shadow whispering truths he doesn't want to face. And these truths, they come alive when she's no longer answering his texts, when her perfume is only a ghost on his clothes, when he realizes her silence is not a punishment, it's a boundary. You see, the powerful woman is not loud. She doesn't beg, doesn't plead, doesn't try to fix a man still at war with himself. She doesn't scream to be understood. She simply withdraws with elegance, with finality, and with something deeper, self-respect. And that withdrawal? It is a mirror that reflects his own emotional immaturity back at him, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Carl Jung wrote that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The man who loses a powerful woman begins to see that truth unfold in real time. She was not just a lover, she was a lesson, wrapped in softness and steel. Her presence invited him to confront his projections, to dismantle the stories he inherited about control, validation, and vulnerability. But most of all, she revealed to him his own fear, the fear of being truly seen, because she saw him, not just his charm or his ambition or the mask he wore in public. She saw the broken little boy hiding behind the need to impress, the one still seeking his mother's validation, the one terrified of being vulnerable. And so he turned every moment of emotional intimacy into a battlefield. He didn't lose her because she was impossible. He lost her because she was real. And real women threaten illusions. That's the first thing he admits in silence, alone. That she was not difficult. She was demanding of depth. And he wasn't ready. But here's the twist. He will never say these things to anyone. Not to his friends. Not to his therapist. And certainly not to her. He will wear his detachment like armor. Pretend he's moved on. Maybe even sleep with someone else. But in the quiet hours, when no one is watching, he will scroll through old photos, reread the messages she once sent, and feel a weight in his chest that no distraction can erase. Because you don't forget a woman who knew her worth. You don't forget the woman who didn't need you, but chose you anyway. And then walked away when you couldn't rise. It's a strange thing, how loss becomes the crucible. It's not until the powerful woman is gone that he begins to evolve. Pain is a teacher no man invites, but every man remembers. And so, in the late night hours, he admits another forbidden truth, that she was the only one who ever made him question who he had become. She didn't control him. She awakened him. Her silence was not revenge. It was revelation. She didn't play games. She showed him what it means to be met at the soul. And when he failed to rise, she simply returned to her own throne. No drama, no chaos, just sacred withdrawal. And now he walks through the world with the ghost of her wisdom haunting his every interaction. He notices things, the lack of depth in others, the absence of fire in empty connections, the way no one else listens the way she did, without judgment, without ego, with eyes that seemed to reach into the parts of him even he didn't understand. Some men never recover from that kind of loss, not because she destroyed them, but because she introduced them to a version of themselves they couldn't sustain, a version that required truth, humility, growth. He now understands why she stopped explaining herself, why she didn't fight to stay. The feminine divine does not force its presence where it's not honored. It simply exits, quietly, powerfully. And as the years pass, he begins to admit the final thing. He didn't lose a woman. He lost an entire world. He lost an entire world. And not just one made of her laughter or the warmth of her skin, but a dimension of himself he didn't know he was capable of entering until she unlocked it. That's the most devastating part of losing a powerful woman. She doesn't just walk out of your life. She leaves with the version of you that only existed in her presence. The version that dared to soften, to dream, to be vulnerable. With her, he almost glimpsed who he could have become. Not the man society shaped, but the man his soul had been silently longing to become. But the ego wasn't ready. It still clung to domination over connection, control over surrender. In her strength, he saw everything he wasn't, and it threatened him. Because when a woman walks in self-possession, she is not impressed by surface. She wants the storm and the silence. She wants the man beyond the mask. And he didn't know how to give her that. Not because he didn't want to, but because he had never met that part of himself. So now, in the aftermath, he begins to admit another truth. He didn't understand the value of what he had until it demanded more than performance, until her depth asked him to descend into his own. And descent, that sacred underworld where real change happens, is where most men run. Because to descend is to leave behind the illusion of control, to feel pain, to confront the shadow. And this woman, she was the shadow's mirror. Not because she was broken, but because she was whole. Because she had done her work, and her very presence illuminated how much he hadn't. Jung spoke of anima, the feminine aspect of a man's unconscious, the bridge to intuition, to soul, to emotional depth. Most men project this anima onto women unconsciously, and when they do, they don't love the woman. They love the reflection of their own hidden longing. And when she refuses to act out his fantasy, when she remains sovereign, he calls her difficult, dramatic, cold. But he's not angry with her. He's angry with himself for not knowing how to hold what she offered. Her love wasn't soft in the way he expected. It wasn't the kind that coddled his wounds while he stayed unaccountable. No, it was a fierce, compassionate, spiritual fire. The kind that calls a man into initiation. And initiations are never comfortable. He now sees that she wasn't punishing him when she pulled away. She was preserving herself. She wasn't emotionally distant. She was discerning. She wasn't cold. She was tired of shrinking. And he realizes, far too late, that her silence was not emptiness. It was a final act of grace, because she could have stayed and watched him erode his own potential. She could have begged, or manipulated, or tried to fix him. But that is not the path of a woman who has walked through her own shadows and returned whole. That kind of woman, the alchemical woman, she doesn't tether herself to someone still afraid of his own transformation. And now that she's gone, he begins to feel the edges of that transformation. Knocking. The memories come back in flashes. The way she looked at him when he wasn't speaking, like she was reading the parts of him he was too afraid to write. The way she held silence not as a weapon, but as a sacred space for truth. The way her boundaries were not walls, but invitations to rise, to grow, to meet her on equal ground. But he didn't know how to stand there. He wanted love without accountability, passion without pressure, depth without dissent. And so now, as the seasons shift and the world moves forward, he finds himself haunted by what could have been, not as regret, but as revelation. Because now, every woman he meets is measured against the one who didn't just love him. She challenged him. She stood still when he tried to provoke her. She stayed soft when he raised his voice. She walked away without slamming the door, because she didn't need to be right. She only needed to be free. And there's something devastating in that kind of freedom for the man who lost it, because it forces him to look in the mirror and whisper the one thing he would never say out loud. She was too much for the man I was, but she was made for the man I was meant to become. The man he was meant to become. That phrase lingers in his mind like smoke in an empty room. It's no longer about her, not truly. It's about everything she awakened in him, then left him alone to face. When a powerful woman exits a man's life, she doesn't just leave a vacancy, she leaves a challenge, a rite of passage he can either accept or avoid. And while the world may praise his strength, his career, his social image, none of that soothes the internal fracture her absence made visible. Because in losing her, he didn't just lose affection, he lost access to a deeper life. He begins to feel it in moments he can't explain. The emotional numbness that follows casual intimacy, the hollow after the chase, the restless ache that arrives not from loneliness, but from a soul that once tasted meaning and now starves for it. She didn't addict him with attention. She addicted him to presence. And presence, once felt, cannot be replaced with distraction. You see, most men are taught to desire what looks good, what validates them, what makes them feel powerful. But the powerful woman? She demands that he become powerful, not in dominance, but in depth. She doesn't flatter his ego. She reveals its limits. She doesn't submit to his wounds. She reflects them back in silence. And when he tries to win with the same tricks, withdrawal, pride, ambiguity, she doesn't chase. She transcends. And this is what he admits when no one is watching. He never truly knew what intimacy was until he lost her. Her love wasn't performative. It was rooted, sacred, sometimes maddening, but always real. And real love, unlike fantasy, requires the death of illusion. That's what terrified him the most. Not her strength, but the fact that she saw his weakness and still chose him, until he made it impossible for her to stay. There's an archetype here, ancient, almost mythological. The man who meets the sacred feminine and fails the test, not because he is evil, but because he is unready. Think of Psyche and Eros, of Samson and Delilah, of Tristan and Isolde. These stories were never just about love. They were about transformation. And every man who loses a powerful woman is forced to confront a truth the ego has been avoiding. Love is not given. It is earned through presence, accountability, and emotional courage. She didn't ask for perfection. She asked for honesty, for him to put down the sword and pick up the mirror, to stop hiding behind ambition and admit he was afraid of losing control, of not being enough, of being truly loved, because real love threatens the false self. It calls the soul forward. It demands surrender. And surrender is terrifying to a man who has built his identity on defense. So now, months or even years later, he walks with the quiet knowledge that she didn't abandon him. She released him back to himself. But here's where the story shifts. Not all men stay asleep. Some begin to awaken, not from comfort, but from the pain of having touched something sacred and letting it slip through their hands. This is the inner alchemy Jung spoke of, the confrontation with the shadow, the willingness to meet the disowned parts of the self and say, I see you. I am no longer afraid of you. And for those who accept this path, the loss becomes initiation. Her absence becomes the teacher. The grief becomes the doorway. Not all men walk through it, but those who do change. He stops looking for her in other women. He stops playing games. He stops pretending. Instead, he begins to become the man who could have kept her, not to win her back. That fantasy died long ago, but to honor the version of himself that only she ever truly believed in. And that's when the deepest truth emerges. He wasn't ready when he had her, but because he lost her, now he is becoming. Becoming is a silent revolution. It doesn't shout or announce itself. It's forged in solitude, in the long nights when he finally sits with the ache instead of numbing it, in the mornings when he no longer chases validation, but integrity, in the quiet decisions to speak honestly, to listen deeply, to stay when it would be easier to run. He no longer seeks the thrill of being wanted. He now craves the sanctity of being understood. He begins to notice the difference between desire and devotion, between performance and presence. And slowly, layer by layer, the man who once feared emotional exposure begins to disrobe the armor that made intimacy impossible. This, Jung would say, is individuation, the integration of the unconscious into the conscious, the journey of becoming whole, and the powerful woman, though absent, remains etched into the architecture of his transformation. She is no longer a person in his life. She is a mythic force in his psyche, a symbol of truth, of depth, of sacred feminine wisdom that shattered his illusions and revealed the hollowness beneath them. He now realizes she didn't reject him. She rejected the version of him that refused to evolve. And that rejection? It was mercy disguised as loss. Because had she stayed, he might have continued to stagnate, to manipulate, to survive instead of awaken. So he admits another truth, the one that both humbles and redeems him. Her leaving saved me from myself. He watches the way other men speak of women now, and something in him recoils. The casual objectification, the jokes about control, the bravado about being unbothered. He recognizes it, not because he judges them, but because he was them. And now he knows better. He sees how the world teaches men to fear the feminine, to fear softness, mystery, emotional truth. And in doing so, it leaves them exiled from their own souls. But her? She was the map back. Her depth was terrifying because it held no shortcuts, no rewards for empty charm. She required presence. She required truth. And in losing her, he was forced to ask, who am I without someone to impress? And this perhaps is the most difficult confession of all. I didn't love her the way she deserved, because I hadn't yet learned to love myself beyond the mask I wore. You, the woman listening to this, perhaps you've been her, the one who gave deeply, who offered truth, who waited for him to rise. And when he didn't, you walked, not because you stopped loving him, but because you finally started loving yourself. This narration is not for his redemption, it's for your remembrance, to remind you that his silence now is filled with unspoken reverence, that his ego may never admit it out loud, but his soul has already carved your name into its transformation. And yet, you must not return, not unless he meets you at the depth you once invited him into. Because the woman who walks in her power does not circle back to comfort those who refuse the call. She keeps walking toward truth, toward freedom, toward the man who sees her not as a possession, but as a portal. He sees it now. The way she used to sit with him in stillness, not asking for anything, just waiting for his mask to fall. The way she responded to his wounds, not with shame, but with space. The way her absence now wraps around his life like a lesson he keeps learning, over and over. There's a softness in him now, not weakness, but humility. He doesn't try to recreate what they had. He doesn't seek her replacement. He seeks himself in her memory. And slowly, with reverence, he starts to rebuild. From the inside out. This is the hidden aftermath of loving a powerful woman. No one sees it. He doesn't post about it. He doesn't confess it to his friends. But it shapes him, carves him, hammers him into something real. Because real love, the kind that confronts, expands, and demands the death of the false self, doesn't leave quietly. It leaves with fire. And from that fire, if he chooses, he rises. And if he rises, he does so not in the image the world expected of him, but in the form the soul had always been whispering beneath the noise, stripped of performance, grounded in purpose, scarred but sacred. Now when he speaks, he doesn't speak to impress. He speaks to connect. He no longer interrupts to be heard, but listens to understand. He doesn't chase to conquer. He draws near with presence. His hands are no longer grasping, they are open. His eyes no longer scan for escape, but search for truth. He has begun the descent into the authentic masculine, not dominance, but devotion, not arrogance, but awareness. And when he meets another woman, she may sense it, that he's been through something, not a heartbreak, but a crucifixion of ego. He won't tell her about you, not in words, but in the way he shows up, in the way he protects her softness, not with control, but with consistency, in the way he no longer flees when intimacy touches the places he used to hide. You, the powerful woman, were not the one who failed. You were the one who revealed. You were the turning point in his mythology. And while the world may never credit you for his becoming, the soul always knows. He knows. And in those quiet, unguarded hours, he thanks you. He thanks you for not lowering yourself to match his unpreparedness, for choosing silence over self-abandonment, for embodying standards instead of pleading for behavior. He thanks you for walking away while you still loved him, because that's when it hurt the most, and that's when the mirror shattered clean. The immature man views loss as punishment. The evolving man understands it as purification. So he sits with his regret, but it no longer poisons him. It purifies him. The grief no longer weighs him down. It anchors him. He understands now. You were not trying to change him. You were inviting him to return to his essence. And your departure? It was the final invitation. This is the unseen transformation, the one no one posts about, the one forged in the fire of a woman's absence, the one men don't talk about, because the world has no language for sacred grief, for feminine awakenings, for the way a man's entire emotional landscape can be rearranged by a woman who simply refused to abandon herself to accommodate him. He begins to see her face in dreams, not as fantasy, but as symbol. The guide who led him to the underworld and left him there alone, with nothing but the task of resurrection. And resurrect he does, slowly, painfully, beautifully, until one day he stands before another woman, not with armor, not with illusion, but with a heart that has learned the weight of truth. A man no longer afraid of emotion, no longer terrified of depth. A man no longer obsessed with being needed, but ready to be known. He carries no bitterness, no entitlement, no demand for her return. He doesn't expect applause for his becoming. He simply is, calm, aware, unshakable. He no longer seeks love to fill a void. He seeks it to share, from overflow. And you, the woman who once waited for this version of him, will feel the shift in the air long before you ever cross paths again. If you ever do, You'll feel it when the wind no longer carries his chaos, but his clarity. When the ache you once held softens into peace. When you realize he finally became the man you always knew he could be, just not in your presence. And that too is a gift, because the feminine doesn't always stay to witness the full bloom. Sometimes she plants the seed and walks away. Sometimes her exit is the beginning of everything, the final truth he admits. And perhaps the most painful, she was never mine. She was sent to awaken me. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.